Hi. So this is my presentation on genetic influences on attachment, and I'll be sort of getting into both adult romantic attachment styles as well as the infant attachment styles. And this slide is just a brief little synopsis about attachment theory, which you might already know, but just a little bit of a review. Bowlby and Ainsworth are two of the main researchers on attachment theory, and it basically just states that emotional bonds to others, especially with caregivers, tend to lead to the formation of attachment styles. And they have infant attachment styles and then attachment styles that develop in the future. And usually, your infant attachment style greatly influences your future attachment style as an adult. And there are a lot of problems when attachments are blocked or if attachments don't meet needs. And some of the qualities of healthy attachment are, for example, safe haven, which is when a caregiver provides protections, comfort, and nurturance. A secure base is when a caregiver is present and dependable, which allows for exploration. Proximity maintenance is when the child does not stray too far from the caregiver to ensure safety. And separation distress is when the child becomes anxious and saddened when separated from their caregiver. And then this slide just shows the types of attachment styles. And so there's a secure attachment style, which has healthy boundaries, mutual trust and support, and controlled conflict resolution. So in this case, the person feels that they are worthy and thinks that other people are reliable. And then an anxious attachment is has a fear of abandonment, need for constant validation, and is dependent on the partner for self-worth. And this is when someone feels that they are not worthy, but that others are reliable. And then dismissive avoidant avoids intimacy and vulnerability, commitment issues, guarded and closed off heart. So this is when somebody believes that others are unreliable, but they are worthy. And then finally, a fearful avoidant, fear of rejection, hard time trusting and relying on partner, and low self-esteem. This is when somebody both believes that others are unreliable and that they are not worthy. So the nurture argument in the nature versus nurture in relation to attachment styles tends to be the biggest argument and the one with the most research done. There are a lot of undisputed findings which show a strong correlation between a child's environment and their attachment. And this tends to be the number one reason for a child's attachment later in life. The way a child is raised and what their relationship with their caregiver is like has the biggest impact on present and future attachment style. So whatever their relationship with their caregiver is usually depends on what their infant attachment style is and greatly affects their romantic attachment styles later as adults. Without early bonding and attachment, children have difficulty forming relationships with peers later in life. And the quality of these childhood relationships also greatly affects the child's idea of attachment. So these early bonding, this early bonding needs to be good quality, or else they're gonna have problems with their relationships with their peers way later in life. Researchers argue that nurture has the most influence on attachment, but there are still some genetic aspects within the brain. And so again, the nurture argument is really the most important part of attachment theory, but there are a lot of genetic aspects within the brain that can also explain these things. And so the nature argument, although most research on attachment is done in relation to caregiver and child relationships, there is information on genetic causes of attachment. When doing multiple studies involving twins, researchers have found genes in the brain which can affect attachment-related anxiety and avoidance, since there is a strong link between attachment security and emotion regulation abilities. So there are a lot of genes within the brain, within a person that tend to correlate with attachment security. And most of the time, they usually end up being much stronger when you have both the environmental aspect and the genetic aspect together. The serotonin transporter linked polymorphism, short allele, and the dopamine D4 receptor gene have both been associated with attachment. And these are two genes with variations that tend to show differences in attachment security within people. To begin, I'm going to talk a little bit about adult romantic attachment styles and genetics. So there is a genetic correlation between attachment-related anxiety and attachment-related avoidance. A lot of studies have found that depressive symptoms and 2 measures of negative emotionality, alienation, and stress reaction are also correlated to genetics. However, these specific things they don't go hand in hand with the attachment-related anxieties. So you don't need to have them to see the correlation between the attachment styles and genetics. Additive genetic effects account for 37% of variance in secure attachment, 43% of variance in fearful attachment, and 25% of variance in preoccupied attachment styles. And additive genetic effects occur when 2 or more genes source a single contribution to the final phenotype. It also accounted for 45% of attachment-related anxiety and 36% of attachment-related avoidance. So basically, all of these studies have found that within adult romantic attachment styles in the future, there are also a lot of genetic effects which account for the different types of attachment or the types of traits within those attachments. So like 37% of variance in secure attachment is accounted for by genetic effects. So someone with secure attachment probably has a little bit of a genetic aspect that caused them to have that secure attachment, as well as their environmental situation or their relationship with their caregiver. And so just to get into the 5-HTT gene, so this gene has great importance in brain development and in individual differences of mood and emotional regulation. So it's really important in the mood and emotional regulation, which usually ends up in being influenced by attachment style. So those things usually go pretty hand in hand. And genetic variation in this gene has been proven to be involved in differences in infant attachment organization. There's a polymorphism in the linked promoter region because of a 44 base pair deletion, which results in a long or short allele. And the short allele is the one that we're going to focus on because that one is the one that can predict attachment style. And this gene also tends to predict depression and anxiety or other types of mental illnesses. So it's not really surprising that it also has an effect on attachment style. So the polymorphism itself is shown to predict higher attachment-related anxiety and avoidance. It tends to cause gene and environmental interaction, which means that if the gene is present and there's some sort of environmental factor, it is almost guaranteed that that person will have higher attachment-related anxiety and avoidance. There's also a significant association between insecure attachment in this short allele. And there is also a relationship between unresolved trauma and loss in the adult attachment interview, which is used in experiments to figure out adult attachment styles in the person's traits. And so they tend to see that there's a lot of unresolved trauma and loss in people that have this polymorphism. And then just a little bit more about the polymorphism in the gene and environment correlation. So a lot of times with the different types of parenting styles in this gene, it tends to show that like the way that the caregiver acts with the child is also just as important as the gene. So the two of them together tend to make a much stronger predictor of having high attachment anxiety, etc. So there was a study that did show that non-maltreated infants showed a correlation between the polymorphism and attachment security, which shows that if they didn't have the polymorphism, they did not have attachment security, but the maltreated infants that did have the polymorphism showed significant attachment insecurity. And then infants with low maternal sensitive responsiveness in the short allele show predicted attachment security. So in another study, it had infants with low maternal sensitive responsiveness and high maternal sensitive responsiveness, where basically like the mother either responds quickly or a lot slower to the child's needs. And basically the children with the short allele and low maternal sensitive responsiveness tended to have much higher levels of attachment insecurity or attachment anxiety and etc. So they can predict attachment security based on whether they have the short allele or not. And then the next gene that I talked about earlier is the dopamine D4 receptor gene. And this gene plays a really important role in cognitive and emotional processes in the prefrontal cortex. And so the 7 repeat functional variant is associated with lower dopamine receptor efficiency. And so this functional variant is the one that tends to show the differences in attachment security. So it actually predisposes infants to developing a disorganized attachment. So this specific gene with the 7 repeat functional variant tends to develop a disorganized attachment for the infants and later in life. It's really important in the gene and environment interaction as well. So it tends to be a lot stronger when both the gene and a specific environmental situation is present. Therefore, like children, for example, we were talking about the low maternal sensitivity before. So a child with this dopamine D4 receptor gene in the 7 repeat functional variant who has a mother with low maternal sensitive responsiveness would basically be way more predisposed to develop a disorganized attachment than a normal child. In conclusion, environmental influences have the strongest correlation to attachment styles, but there are still many genetic components to attachment. Attachment-related anxiety and avoidance are 2 things that are affected by genetics. The 5-HTT-LPR polymorphism is shown to predict higher attachment-related anxiety and avoidance. And there's also a significant association between insecure attachment and this short allele. And then the 5-HTT short allele is strongest within a gene and environment interaction. And then the dopamine D4 receptor shows a relationship between the variant and the development of a disorganized attachment within infants. Thank you for watching, and these are my references.